All right, this lesson is going to be on corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So we're going to take a look at some of the other things that we can prove once we have proven that triangles are congruent. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to basically understand that we can now use Cpctc, corresponding parts of congruent triangles, to prove that pieces of triangles are congruent. All right, this proof we've already done. So we've already shown how when just given this little piece of information, so AB, BD, BC, and BE, given this little bit of information here, we've already proven that these two triangles are congruent by side angle side. But now let's just suppose that instead of trying to prove that those two triangles are congruent, now what we're trying to prove is something like angle A is congruent to angle D. Now, once we know that these two triangles are congruent to each other, then I can state that their corresponding angles and their corresponding sides are congruent to each other. So I could actually make the statement that AE is congruent to CD, or I could make the statement that angle A is congruent to angle D, or I could make the statement that angle E is congruent to angle C. And that's because those are corresponding angles and corresponding sides. So in this triangle here, in this diagram, after I've gone through and proven all this information, I can now state that angle A is congruent to angle D. And the reason for that is because they are corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So that's now actually that's something that we can use now to prove that parts of congruent triangles are congruent to each other. So to shorten that up, we simply say corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Cpctc. So if the triangles are congruent, we have corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Cpctc. So is angle B congruent to angle D? Right, here's angle B, and we're wondering is it congruent to angle D? Well, these two triangles here, we can specifically state that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDF. And the reason we can state that these two are congruent to each other is because of side, side, side. And now since both of the triangles are congruent to each other, I can now specifically state that angle B is congruent to angle D. And that's because they are corresponding parts of congruent triangles, and those are going to be congruent. So prove the following statement. Prove that those two sides, BC is congruent to AD. Prove that those two are congruent to each other. So we're trying to figure out BC and AD. So if we can prove that the two triangles are congruent to each other, then we can use the Cpctc to prove that those sides are congruent. So right now, we have that AB is congruent to CD. AB, CD. We have that angle BAC is congruent to DCA. Now we also know that AC would be congruent to itself. So we can specifically state that AC is congruent to AC. And remember, when two triangles are pushed up together and they share a side, that is the reflexive property. Well, now we've just shown that we have side, angle, side, so I can specifically state that triangle BAC is congruent to triangle DCA, and that's because of side, angle, side. Well, since I've shown that the two triangles are congruent to each other, I can now state that their corresponding parts are congruent. So I can now specifically state that BC is congruent to AD. And that's because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Again, prove the following statement. So here, given information, we know that BC, segment BC, is congruent to segment AD, and that's given to us. We also know that CD is congruent to BA. and that's given to us. But now we can also state that BD is congruent to BD because they're two triangles that are pushed up and they share a side now, and that's the reflexive property. Well, this now gives us side, side, side. So for step number 4, I can specifically state that triangle BCD is congruent to triangle DAB, and that's based off of side, side, side. And now, because we have corresponding parts, we can state that angle A is congruent to angle C, and that is because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, we'll do this last one here. So here we are given a couple pieces of information. The first one is that CD is congruent to AB, and that's given to us. We also know that DBC is congruent to angle ADB, and that's given to us as well. Now they share side BD, so we can state that BD is congruent to BD, and that, since they share the side, that would be a reflexive property. And this gives us enough information to state that the two triangles are congruent. This one here is a right triangle, and we have the hypotenuse and we have a leg. So we can state that triangle ABD is congruent to CDB, and that's because of hypotenuse leg. Now, since I've proven that the triangles are congruent, I can now state that any of their corresponding parts are congruent. So I can specifically state that angle A is congruent to angle C, and that's because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, that completes the lecture on this on Cpctc. By the end of this, you should hopefully have a pretty decent understanding of when and why we use the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we can now use that to prove other pieces of triangles are congruent to each other.